Thank you. Okay, thank you all for being here. So I'm going to talk about X-rays outside the laboratory. So we're both moving far away from the talks we've just had, and also quite a way back in time. So I'm going to talk about the introduction of X-rays in 1896 and shortly afterwards, particularly in the public eye. So I'm going to talk about reports and the ways that X-rays were presented to the public, and local events with respect to X-rays, so the ways that people might have encountered X-rays in the public arena. I'm going to say a little bit briefly about commercial interests, because there were some very important firms in the West Yorkshire area involved in early X-rays, and a little bit about medical uses, which of course also involves the public as the patients. I have to apologise, I unfortunately couldn't get here for the earlier talks, so if I repeat anything that was said in the earlier talks, apologies for that. If I'm telling you stuff you already know, just wave your hands about or something. I should also say, well, not even just me, but anyone could talk about this subject for a very long time. There's an awful lot to say, so it's going to be a bit of a whirlwind survey, so kind of hang on to your seats and we'll stop for breath at the end. I should also warn you that there are one or two images towards the latter part of the talk that some people might find a bit disturbing. I will warn you, so you can close your eyes if you think you need to, and I'll tell you when it's safe to open them again. And there will be a link to Bragg. There'll be a tiny link to Bragg in there, so it's not entirely disconnected from the rest of the day. Okay, this image, by the way, is my favourite X-ray image. It was the one that was about as far from the laboratory as I could find. It is an original image from 1896 by a French radiographer. And it's crayfish on a plate. And it's just, I think it's incredibly surreal, almost Dadaist. So it's just there because of that. Okay, so a very quick run through the history then. I imagine you've seen this image at some point today already. This is the first publicly displayed X-ray image. Wilhelm Röntgen in Germany discovered the rays in December 1895. He announced his discovery at the start of January 1896 in a public lecture at the Physical Medical Society of Würzburg, and presented this image of his wife's hand, showing the wedding ring. Culturally, this was really shocking. Prior to this, bones and the skeleton were a symbol of death. You didn't see the bones of any living creature. So to actually be able to see human bones was really quite shocking culturally, and carried a lot of baggage for a lot of people. The first press report was in the Neue Freipresse in Vienna on January the 5th. That was because one of their reporters was the son of one of the physicists who was at Röntgen's first announcement, so he got the scoop on this story. It quickly reached Britain via foreign correspondence, and the following day there was an announcement in the Daily Chronicle. And within a couple of weeks, the first English translation of Röntgen's paper, which in English is On a New Kind of Rays, was published in Nature. And that translation was by Arthur Stanton, who was a physicist working at Owens College in Manchester, and we'll hear a little bit more about them a little bit later. The popular press quickly got in on the act, so we see here an image from Punch. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Punch, the periodical? Some. Okay, so it was kind of like the Private Eye of its time, a very satirical journal that was a sort of attacking all sorts of issues. And you can see here, I don't know if you can quite make that out, it says, thanks to the discovery of Professor Röntgen, the German Emperor will now be able to obtain an exact photograph of a backbone of unexpected size and strength. And this is actually referring to the Kaiser's interference in colonial affairs that was concerning people at the time. And here's an American one from Life in February of 1896. And you can see here the photographer's asking this nice, jolly-looking farming type to look pleasant for the camera, but the outcome is an image of the Grim Reaper. So this kind of idea of X-rays being quite frightening, of seeing the skeleton as being symbolic of death and so on, is very, very prevalent. So if we come then to a local level, and let's just look at some of the reports in the local press in Yorkshire. Now the first report is in the Yorkshire Post on January the 7th. And on the one hand, they're suggesting that this is the greatest gain to surgery since Harvey's discovery of the circulation of the blood. So far, so good. On the other hand, they're very sceptical. News of this extraordinary fact, if fact it be, comes, however, through a solitary channel, and this not the clearest. It can only be discussed with some amount of scepticism. So if it's true, it's kind of exciting, but not really convinced yet. The next day, there's a further report of new developments, a revolution in surgical diagnosis, the alleged photographs of the living skeleton. Still not convinced, because remember, they wouldn't have seen the pictures. They're relying on telegrams coming from the continent with news of what's going on. They won't yet have seen any pictures. And in neighbouring Bradford on Friday, January the 10th, they talk about the story as being in the style of Jules Verne. It's science fiction almost. And they go on with quite a long editorial, which basically boils down to, you know the common saying, you make a better door than a window? Well, it might not be true, because actually flesh might not be that solid, and light might be able to pass through bodies if this science fiction story is true. So, ongoing reports appear in the local press of national and international developments in X-rays, and there's a lot of correspondence in the local press from local physicists and schoolmasters talking about theoretical aspects and what really are these rays and what do we think they might do. But by January the 29th, we start to get real local evidence. So now people can see these pictures for themselves and the scepticism kind of starts to drop away. And this is an advert that was in the Yorkshire Post on January the 29th. And this is from a chap called Archibald Allen Campbell Swinton. Now, he was a very well-known electrical engineer and entrepreneur. If there was money to be made out of something electrical, Campbell Swinton would make it. That was his raison d'etre, really. And you can see here that he's advertising printing blocks or prints from his copyright negatives. And the subjects at present ready comprise a hand showing bones. This really iconic image, the human skeleton, pops up everywhere. The contents of a pocket, contents of a purse or box. Again, showing you things you wouldn't see. Here's a box with things in it you can't see. And here's the X-ray that shows you the coins, the key, whatever the bits and pieces that were in there. A living frog showing the bones and others. Surgical subjects expected shortly. Not only was Campbell Swinton selling the images of X-rays, he was selling himself. He was on a lecture tour showing off this new technique. And the first local report we have is the 30th of January. And he lectures to the Scarborough Philosophical and Archaeological Society at Scarborough Museum. There's no practical demonstration on this occasion. He's taking his lantern slides of the images he's made in his laboratory and touring the country with them, basically. He's also lending or possibly hiring them out, because on the same day, at the engineering department at the Yorkshire College, which became the university shortly afterwards, there's a conversazione. If you've not come across these, they're basically public scientific evenings where the well-to-do populace would come along and there'd be demonstrations and lectures of the latest developments in science and so on. So the engineering department here at Leeds have their first one on the 30th of January, and it includes an illustrated talk on the X-rays by the lecturer in electrical engineering, J.D. Cormack, using slides lent by Campbell Swinton. Now we move over to Bradford. Now, if you detect a hint of competition between Leeds and Bradford here, that's because I'm from Bradford and we're in Leeds. And if you come from around here, you know what it's like. So, Friday the 31st of January, they also have a conversazione held by the Bradford Scientific Association here at the Church Institute in Bradford. This picture isn't from 1896, by the way. They not only have a lecture with slides, they have a live demonstration. Mr. Knowles, the physics master at the Technical College, brings his equipment to the lecture theatre and shows people the process of making an X-ray. Now, they were really excited, but probably also quite bored, because the exposure would have been at least half an hour, possibly longer, but nonetheless, people were very thrilled to be able to see this. OK, back to Leeds. They don't want to be left behind. This is reported on Saturday, February the 1st. Remember, this isn't a month after the announcement of this discovery, so people are really quickly grabbing hold of this. So at the Central Higher Grade School, which was at the junction of Woodhouse Lane and Upper George Street, the principal of the school, 2 of the masters, and a chap called F.W. Branson, who we'll come back to, are not doing public experiments, but it's reported that they've done experiments. They've made images of various inanimate objects, and they've tested different substances to sort of see the penetrative powers of the X-rays and how do different metals and wood, various things show up on an X-ray image. And a few days later, Mr. Branson presents his slides, together with some of Campbell Swinton's, to members of the Leeds Photographic Society at their annual Lantern Slide exhibition. Now you start to see here the variety of people that are taking up X-rays. We've had Campbell Swinton, the electrical entrepreneur, we've had the physics master and the lecturer in electrical engineering. We now have the Photographic Society. This is because initially, at least, you have to take a photographic image. You have to have a photographic plate to capture the image. You have to develop that. And it's actually called, very often, the new photography. So photographers are really interested in the X-rays. And the Leeds Photographic Society, no less than any others. So they have their exhibition, and Mr. Branson presents a variety of slides showing the images. Back in Bradford, Mr. Knowles is still at it. He's been working harder. He presents his results to a meeting of the Bradford Scientific Association. He's moved on from just basic objects and coins in a box. He's now got a sole, that's as in a fish, not the sole of a shoe, a frog, a rabbit's paw, a human foot through the stocking, and other objects which indicate their anatomical structure in remarkable degree. So you can see the very rapid progress in a week. We've gone from, here's a box with some coins in it, to quite detailed anatomical images. Back in Leeds, Branson's still on with it. He demonstrates the methods employed in producing the mysterious X-rays for the Leeds Photographic Society at the Philosophical Hall. And here it is. The Philosophical Hall was... Where was the Philosophical Hall? I can't remember. It was somewhere in Leeds. Anyway. And it was announced as the beginning of a new era in photography. So people were really excited. But it wasn't just the photographers and the electricians and so on. There were public lectures. On Sunday, February the 16th, there's a general Sunday lecture for the public at the Leeds Theatre Royal. This is roughly where the Hedgerow Shopping Centre is now, on the marvels of modern photography. And it included a display of Röntgen photographs, accompanied by an explanation of the technique in the popular mode for the people. So you can see the sort of range of people who are interested in X-rays and who have access to X-rays and the amount of public excitement. Here's an interesting little one that just shows you the sort of entertainment value. This is the East Parade Chapel on East Parade. They had a 4-day bazaar in May of 1896, and it included an exhibition of the new photography. And there was a room there where people could go in and X-rays were taken and things were displayed. The entire 4 days of this money-raising bazaar, basically. Sadly, I don't think it was successful because the building was demolished 2 years later. But worth a try. And one more example of the range of people involved. Now, this is a report from Nature on November the 5th, 1896, and talks about a Yorkshire lad, Mr. Watson of Keighley, who's made his own Crookes tube and taken his own Röntgen photographs. Now, he was a 19-year-old schoolboy at the time, but this sets him on a path because this was George William Watson, who throughout his career later on was consultant physician to Leeds General Infirmary and St James's Hospital, and also a professor of medicine at the University of Leeds. So his scientific interest from a fairly early age put him in good stead. Okay. So much for the public. Let's have a little look at commercial interests. Now, there was a firm of photographers in Bradford called Appleton & Co. They were very famous earlier in the 19th century for their carte de visite, as you see here. They were also really hot on the latest photographic techniques. They developed a lot of magic lantern equipment. They were very instrumental in developing cinema cameras and equipment. In fact, in 1897, they invented a machine which would both film, develop and show cinefilm. They took it down to London on a train. They filmed Queen Victoria's Jubilee procession. They brought it back on the train, developed the film on the train and showed it in Bradford the same day to an audience of allegedly more than 100,000 people, shown on a big white screen in Foster Square in the centre of town. So they were very cutting edge with the latest technology. And they were at this Conversazione for the Bradford Scientific Association on the 31st of January, displaying their photographic equipment. And they must have seen the display of X-rays and they must have immediately noticed the commercial possibilities. Because within a few days, they'd bought their own set of X-ray equipment and were taking images. By the 5th of February, they'd managed to get reasonable images of the human hand and various other parts of the body. And by the 8th of February, within a week or so of them first seeing X-rays, they feel confident enough to start advertising their services. One of the first successes was a doctor from Manningham in Bradford who brought a patient with a lump on his finger. And they suspected that this might be some sort of bony tumour or some sort of malignancy and were in two minds as to whether to amputate the finger. They took an X-ray. It turned out it wasn't a bony lump, it was just an abscess, and it saved the man's finger. They didn't need to amputate. And in a similar way, Appletons did a lot of work for local doctors for a number of years. By May, they were advertising radiographic services nationally in both photographic and medical press, and they'd already successfully produced images of, for example, the spine, which is a particularly difficult image to get clearly. So again, you can see this progress from simple coins in a box at the end of January to detailed images of the spine on a commercial basis by May. And they may have been one of the earliest providers of radiographic services, perhaps the earliest outside London. But they would have had competition. And I think something's been said about this firm, Reynolds and Branson. I believe one of the earlier talks mentioned them. Now, they were a very well-known Leeds firm, manufacturing chemists and optical instrument manufacturers. And they were formed in 1883 when Frederick Woodward Branson, does that name ring any bells? Entered into partnership with Richard and Fred Reynolds. So this is the Branson we've heard doing all the demonstrations and the work around Leeds earlier on. He had wide-ranging scientific interests, including photography. He was well known as an expert on the latest photographic techniques. So it's no surprise that Reynolds and Branson should get in on the X-ray commercial possibilities very early. And again, this idea of progress. So he was taking pictures of coins in a box and so on at the beginning of February. By August, at an exhibition of medical supplies, these are the kinds of things that Reynolds and Branson are showing. Apparatus including new forms of screens for greatly reducing the time for exposure, aluminium X-ray meters for measuring the intensity, arrangements for taking one or more prints at the same time as the negative. That would save a huge amount of time for people. And a large collection of radiographs taken by them illustrating important surgical cases. So you could buy these for use in teaching and public lectures and so on. So you can see how very quickly people are working and developing the technology. And here's my link to Bragg. Now, I think this might have been mentioned in some respect in an earlier lecture. So in May of 1896, a man called Barber, who worked for a manufacturing chemist in Adelaide, South Australia, but originally came from Leeds, came back to Leeds for a holiday. Now, he knew about X-rays and he knew about the difficulties of getting good X-rays without a very high-quality Crooks tube, which were really hard to get hold of. So whilst he was in Leeds, he went to Reynolds and Branson and he got 2 of their very high-quality tubes and took them back to Adelaide. He and his colleagues at work tried to take X-rays, but found that they didn't have sufficient power. The commercial power supply was unreliable, and the batteries they had were not powerful enough. So they went to the University of Adelaide, to a laboratory that had very powerful batteries. Guess whose laboratory that was? Bragg the Elder. So they took very successful X-rays there, and here is one. You'll see here, there's a needle embedded in this woman's hand. She'd had trouble with it for a long time. Just in case you can't see, there it is. She'd had trouble with this for a long time. The doctors couldn't locate and remove it, But they took the X-ray, and then it was a very quick and simple operation once they knew exactly where they were going to take it out. Bragg himself had been working on X-rays, but he'd had problems and he wasn't getting very good results because he had inferior Crooks tubes. So I think it's probably quite important in the development of Bragg's ideas and work with X-rays that he now had access to these very high-quality tubes from Reynolds and Branson here in Leeds that allowed him to get successful results and probably, if nothing else, encouraged him a bit to keep going with his X-ray work. Just a quick rundown of some other applications. These were all things that were reported in the press within the first month or two of 1896. So potential applications in the iron and steel trades, analysing alloys, finding faults in casting so you could see if there were bubbles or cracks in cast metal. At the Museum of Natural History in Vienna, there was a mummy. It was a human-shaped mummy, but it had an inscription that suggested it might be an ibis, the sacred bird of Egypt. But of course they couldn't tell without demolishing the mummy. So they were all very puzzled and frustrated until X-rays. So they take the mummy to the Department of Photography, they X-ray the mummy, and lo and behold, it is actually a bird. There are other ideas about photographing the contents of sealed letters. It says that not all kinds of paper are equally transparent, but suggests that you might want to wrap your letters in tinfoil anyway, just to be on the safe side. Examining infernal machines. There was a problem in France at the time with letter bombs, and it was suggested you could use X-rays to identify letter bombs before you opened them and triggered them. And detecting fake gemstones and so on. Pictures. We haven't had many pictures, so let's quickly run through some of the kinds of pictures people will be looking at here. These come from Owens College, Manchester. Remember I said Arthur Stanton did the first translation of Röntgen's paper? He worked in Arthur Schuster's lab, and they were very, very involved in early X-rays in this country. And the one on the left here is a pantomime dancer's foot. It was injured, she was having problems, and the doctors couldn't work out what was going on. And again, you can see on the X-ray the needle. And this is a hand with osteoarthritis. So you can see here the degeneration in the bone in this arthritic hand. These are some of the most beautiful X-ray images ever taken. These are from a technical manual, basically, by Ader and Valenta. Now, it was designed to actually give people the technical details of various images, but very quickly became known for being some of the most beautiful images ever. And here are just a couple of examples of frogs and a snake. On a more modest note, lots of physicians had their own X-ray machines and made their own collections, and this comes from an album of a physician called Ernest Payne, and it's a foot in a shoe. Again, very common, seeing things you would never normally see, so you can see all the nails in the shoe holding it together and so on. Here's an ibis mummy. I don't know if it's the same one we talked about before, but mummies of various kinds were quite often X-rayed. So you can see here the delicate bones of the bird's wing, etc. But people also X-rayed objects. These are X-ray tubes. It's an X-ray image of X-ray tubes. A lot of this was done for sort of calibrating perception. People were X-raying different substances, different objects to see what they looked like. So that you can go, so that's what an X-ray of gold looks like, so that you can then identify gold when you see it X-rayed again and so on. So lots of different objects were X-rayed for those sorts of purposes. Here's a more mundane one. Again, these are all from the first couple of months after the announcement. So here you can see spectacles, there's a watch chain, bits of jewellery and so on. And personal X-rays. These are the hands of the Emperor and Empress of Russia, who specifically asked someone to come to the palace to X-ray their hands, complete with cufflinks and jewellery. This was quite common too. And also things like this. This is a little later, but this was a book on the health problems caused by wearing tight corsets, full of images like this, rather risque for the time, of a lady in a corset. So very quickly then, let me really rapidly just quickly look at some medical uses. So here's the classic kind of thing you would expect. Here's the hand of someone who's been shot with a shotgun, and you can see all of the metal shot embedded in his hand. And you can imagine that it's much better for the doctors to have that than just to have to poke about with the forceps and see what they could pull out. And this chap actually, I think, had about 130 particles of shot in his hand. And here is the nearest, sort of most local picture of an early X-ray department I could find. This is the Royal Halifax Infirmary in 1899. You can see, just make out the X-ray tubes above the beds there. Doesn't look very hospital-like, really, by our standards, but then hospitals didn't in many cases. And often the rooms would be in the cellar because of the batteries. They had to have massive batteries, so they would often be in the cellar of the hospital. This is Bradford Royal Infirmary. Now, I raised this quickly just to say that not everyone was using X-rays for images. At Bradford Royal Infirmary, they lived without X-rays till 1902. When they got them, it was to treat a particular disease, a form of tuberculosis of the skin. And here's someone being treated for that, not at Bradford. So here's a man in a lead mask, covering his face except for the nose, which is affected. And here is the Crux tube. So this was to treat this very disfiguring skin disease. And here are some of the results. So here's a boy with quite a nasty lesion on his face that he'd had for many years. And after about 15 X-ray treatments, you can see the great improvement. Of course, the problem with this was, as they very quickly discovered, that X-rays have very severe effects. And I'm just going to quickly talk about that. Now, the next image is a little bit horrible, so do look away if you are quite sensitive. Okay, these are the hands of John Hall Edwards. He was one of the pioneers of X-rays in this country. Was born, trained and worked most of his life in Birmingham. These are his hands in 1908. Now, he ended up having the left hand amputated with the forearm. The whole of the fingers of the right hand were amputated because of this X-ray damage. What's really interesting is that he wrote it up for the medical journals, as many of these people did. They wrote about their own death by inches, basically, as if they were a patient, and published it in the medical journals. And Hall Edwards did this. This left hand actually is amputated. This is after it was amputated. And here are the X-rays in the same article of the bones. And you can see, look at where the bone's been eaten away in places. And if you see the very kind of spongy appearance of the bone, it should be nice and dense and solid and black, like this. So this is the damage that the X-rays are doing. And this happened to a great many of the early X-ray pioneers. And I think someone earlier may have mentioned the Martyrs Memorial in Hamburg that was erected in 1936 to the people who died from early X-ray work. There were 169 names on it when it was first erected, and many more were added in the 1950s. So this happened to a lot of people, including the X-ray technician here at Leeds General Infirmary. His name was T.J. Oliver, and he had to have his right hand amputated in 1907 at the age of just 48, subsequently followed by his left hand and his upper lip, and he died of the effects of X-rays. So this really was a serious risk. So just to finish, just because it's quite tragic and sad, and I don't want to downplay it, but I don't want to leave you on too tragic a note. So let me just finish with this. This is an image from a local publication called the Yorkshire Owl, which effectively was the Yorkshire version of Punch. And like everyone else, they got in very quickly on this sort of X-ray, this picking up existing concerns and kind of superimposing X-rays onto them. So if you can make out here, there's a policeman taking a backhander, taking a bribe. In the middle is the stomach of a cannibal with the Book of Common Prayer in it, because the cannibal's eaten the missionary. They also talked in this article about X-raying a moneylender to look for any sign of a heart or a conscience, which they failed to find with the X-rays. And they talked about X-raying the skull of a local alderman who had been drugged with compliments, and after a long exposure with very sensitive plates, the results were inconclusive, although the experimenters thought they might have discerned the nucleus of an idea. So they took the X-ray to the brain expert at the Yorkshire College and asked for his second opinion. And after a long and detailed microscopic examination of the plates, he decided it was a speck of dirt and there was no brain to be found there. So I will leave you with that high opinion of official Demesne Leeds and say thank you very much.